1 year into my marriage, everything seemed stable. But then a bolt of lightning hit my otherwise calm life. My husband suddenly told me I had to take care of my father-in-law, who had become bedridden due to a serious accident. This was my first time handling such a situation, and I found myself struggling to manage. Then, to my shock, my husband and mother-in-law decided to take a vacation in Hawaii, leaving me behind to look after his father. They had no idea that this decision would later bring about a tragedy neither of them could foresee. My name is Marigold, and I am 32 years old. I've always had a passion for cooking, so after graduating from college, I started working for a big restaurant chain. Now, I work in the planning department, developing new menu items. I've been at the company for 8 years, and it was during this time that I met Merrick, the man who would become my husband. 2 years ago, I visited my favorite Japanese pub alone, as I often did after a long day. That evening, I took a seat at the counter, and Merrick happened to be sitting next to me. We struck up a conversation, thanks to the pub owner, and we quickly discovered we were the same age. We got along well, exchanged contact information, and soon Merrick began inviting me out for dinners. As we spent more time together, I found myself drawn to his upbeat and fun personality, and before long, we started dating. It didn't take long for us to fall in love, and after dating for a year, we tied the knot 6 months ago. We now live in a cozy apartment, conveniently located between both of our workplaces. With both of us working, I sometimes slack off on house chores. But Merrick always reassures me with a smile, saying, "You don't have to be perfect at everything. I'm just happy being with you." It makes me feel at ease, knowing that the little things don't matter as much as simply being together. Merrick's sweet and understanding nature makes me feel lucky to be his wife. Our life together was filled with love and laughter, and even 6 months after getting married, we still shared these heartwarming moments. I truly believed that our happiness would last for years to come. But one day, everything changed. I came home from work, and instead of being greeted with the usual "hey" from Merrick, I was met with a heavy silence. Merrick was already in the living room, staring at his phone with a worried expression. My heart sank as I approached him nervously. "Merrick, are you okay?" I asked, sensing something was wrong. He barely looked up and replied, "It's my mom. She called." "Your mom? What happened?" "Dad had an accident," Merrick said, his voice filled with dread. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. I could hardly process what he was saying, but I knew we had to act quickly. I grabbed Merrick's hand, urging him, "We need to go see him right now." But Merrick shook his head. "We can't go yet." "Why not? Is he not doing well?" "He's not, but Mom's with him. She'll stay by his side until he gets better." There was nothing I could do, and Merrick's quiet response only added to my anxiety. I let go of his hand and sank into the couch, feeling helpless. My father-in-law had just turned 67, and despite his age, he had always been in good health, spending his weekends hiking and golfing. The idea of him lying in a hospital bed felt surreal. I could tell Merrick was struggling, too. Not only was his father seriously hurt, but he was also the president of the company Merrick worked for. The weight of it all was clearly overwhelming him. A week later, we were finally able to visit my father-in-law in the hospital. He lay in bed, a weak smile barely visible on his face, as we entered the room. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to hide my concern. He scratched his head, giving me an apologetic look. "Marigold, I'm sorry for worrying you." "Don't be sorry. I'm just relieved that you're safe," I reassured him. He nodded slowly. "I'm all right. Just need some time to recover." His smile, though faint, brought me some relief. But the reality was grim. The accident had left him with a spinal cord injury, and though he could speak, he was paralyzed. The doctors had told us it would take at least 2 months of rehabilitation to assess his condition, and even after he was released from the hospital, he would need ongoing care. During this time, Merrick took over his father's role as president of the company, at least temporarily. Seeing my husband step into such a major position was strange, but he handled it well. However, the stress weighed heavily on him. As we sat in the hospital room, my mother-in-law suddenly pulled me aside. Her words were sharp and condescending. "Marigold," she began, "don't get any ideas. Just because Merrick's the president now doesn't mean you can start enjoying yourself at his expense. Her accusation stung. I have my own job, and I'm doing just fine, I replied firmly. She gave me a smug look. Sure, but you knew who Merrick was before you married him, didn't you? You're quite the opportunist. Her insinuation was clear, and it wasn't the first time she had made these kinds of remarks. She seemed to think I married Merrick for his family's wealth and status, but the truth was, I had no idea about his background when we first met. Still, my mother-in-law's hostility had been there from the beginning, and I had tried to ignore it. But this time, I couldn't hold back. I didn't marry him for his money. I snapped back. Merrick's personality had always drawn me in, but now I couldn't help but feel betrayed. His mother's sharp words hit me hard. What are you on about? You talk to me as if you really know who I am, I shot back, but her gaze remained cold. Exactly. And no matter what you say or do, I will never approve of you, she replied with a smirk. My father-in-law, noticing the tension, asked, Is everything all right? It's nothing, she said quickly, glaring at me before turning away. It was clear as day. My mother-in-law adored Merrick. She probably thought I was just some woman who married her son for his money, especially since we tied the knot after dating for only a year. From the very first moment I met her at our wedding, she had been ruthless toward me. I never imagined she'd continue being so sarcastic and hostile. But what made things even more troubling was that Merrick seemed to worship her. A few days later, he dropped another bombshell on me. Marigold, you know that Dad will be released from the hospital in about 2 months, right? He began. Yeah, why? I asked, sensing something was coming. Well, when that happens, we're moving in with my parents, he said nonchalantly. What? I gasped. Where did this come from? Mom suggested it. She said this would be the perfect time for us to move in together. She can't take care of Dad by herself, he said, as if it were the most logical thing in the world. But we can't just do this so suddenly, I protested. What are you talking about? We're all in this together. Mom's really grateful, he said, brushing off my concerns. I felt utterly confused. It was obvious that Merrick and his mother had already made the decision, and my opinion didn't seem to matter. Every time I tried to bring up the subject afterward, Merrick ignored me, and his devotion to his mother only seemed to grow stronger. Meanwhile, his attitude toward me worsened. Each day, I found myself on the receiving end of constant criticism. How's the packing going? He'd demand. I won't be able to take time off for the move, so you'll have to handle it. You're also going to be in charge of all the housework and taking care of Dad. Don't let Mom down. I was already mentally drained by his words, and the looming move only made things worse. At work, the company was entering its busiest season, and I was barely keeping up with both my job and the overwhelming task of moving. I was physically and mentally exhausted. 2 months later, we moved in, and my father-in-law was finally discharged from the hospital. There was no time for me to catch my breath. I immediately stepped into the role of caregiver. My day started at 3 a.m. I'd prepare breakfast, do the laundry, and then head over to help my father-in-law with his morning massage and change his clothes. After breakfast, I'd feed him before heading to work, always rushing because my time was stretched so thin. Despite my efforts, my mother-in-law was never satisfied. Every morning, just as I was about to leave for work, she would stop me. Marigold, can I have a word? She'd say. I'm sorry, I'm running late, I'd reply, trying to get out the door. What's your rush? Sit down. I need to talk to you about breakfast. It wasn't good enough today, she'd insist, her voice filled with disapproval. I'll fix it when I get back, I'd say, desperate to escape, but she'd raise her voice and demand, no. Sit down. Now. These confrontations made my heart race and my head pound. I started having panic attacks, and my stress levels skyrocketed. Every day, it felt like I was walking on eggshells, trying to avoid triggering her complaints. I was barely making it to work on time, and my coworkers began to notice. They knew something was wrong, but I couldn't tell them the truth. 3 months passed since my father-in-law's return from the hospital, and I was drowning in responsibilities. When I came home from work, I had to start preparing dinner immediately. Even after rushing through it, my husband would find something wrong with every meal. What is this, Marigold? I come home exhausted, and you expect me to eat fish? Really? He'd say, glaring at the plate in front of him. I'm sorry, I'd mutter. I had to leave the kitchen to help your father, so I made something quick. You should make something that boosts my energy. I don't want boiled fish, he'd reply before grabbing a cup of instant noodles and pouring hot water into it. My mother-in-law watched silently, smirking at my defeat. Feeling completely crushed, I went to help my father-in-law prepare for bed. He noticed my pale face and asked gently, Marigold, are you okay? You don't look well. I'm fine, I lied, forcing a smile. I've just been a little stressed with work, that's all. Is that really it? I've heard a lot of yelling lately from my wife and Merrick. Is everything all right? It's nothing. I'm just not very good at a lot of things, I said, trying to reassure him. I didn't want to burden him with my problems, so I kept smiling, even though my heart was heavy with despair. The truth was, I wanted to leave. I wanted to escape this nightmare, but I couldn't bring myself to abandon my father-in-law. What would happen to him if I left? I couldn't just throw everything away. I kept thinking about it, but there was no easy answer. As the end of the year approached, I finally had some time off work. But even on my days off, there was no rest. My husband, as if to twist the knife further, made an outrageous announcement on New Year's Eve. Mom and I are heading to Hawaii, he said, casually packing his bags. What? Hawaii? Now? I asked, shocked. Yeah, we've been planning this for a while, he replied as if it were no big deal. Wait a second. Think about your father. How could you possibly leave him like this? I protested. But he didn't care. When they were leaving for Hawaii, my husband looked at me with a smug grin and said, He's fine with you being here. You're off work, so you might as well do something productive. Both he and my mother-in-law had triumphant expressions on their faces as they proudly showed off their large carry-on cases. They seemed to find my confusion amusing, and it was clear they were trying hard not to laugh. Just before stepping out the door, my husband added, Well, you're going to take care of my father while we're off to Hawaii. We'll be relaxing, so you handle everything here. Then, with a chuckle, they both left and shut the door behind them. At that moment, something inside me snapped. Why was I the one left to handle everything alone? I thought to myself, I've had enough. I'm not going to put up with this any longer. I decided that once they returned from Hawaii, I would divorce Merrick. I was done being treated like a servant. However, until they came back, I resolved to devote myself entirely to taking care of my father-in-law. In the meantime, I stopped doing any extra housework. I made a clear plan. I would let everything slide, focusing only on my father-in-law's care. The next morning, I prepared breakfast for him, as usual. When I walked into his room with a towel to help him clean up and change his clothes, he greeted me with a smile. Marigold, best wishes for the new year, he said. Happy New Year to you too, Dad, I replied, though the cheerfulness felt forced. I was still reeling from the events of the previous night. Where did Merrick and my wife go? They seemed to be in some sort of rush, he asked, looking puzzled. They went to Hawaii, I said, watching his expression change as he let out a deep sigh. Hawaii? Really? He looked skeptical, shaking his head. What's going on? Suddenly, his mood shifted, and he gave me a curious smile. Marigold, I've been waiting for the right moment to talk to you. I owe you an apology, he began, his voice calm but serious. Wait, what do you mean? I asked, not understanding where this was headed. He continued, I've been able to get out of bed on my own for a few days now, but I kept it to myself. I wanted to see how things played out. Confused, I asked him to explain further. Slowly, he revealed everything. He told me that he had noticed how I was being mistreated, how Merrick and my mother-in-law had been ignoring his needs while pushing all the responsibility onto me. I asked them to help me with small errands, but they refused. They didn't care at all. It wasn't just that, though. My father-in-law shared that he had received complaints from the company's executive director. Apparently, Merrick had been slacking off as acting president, and this trip to Hawaii was the final straw. My father-in-law suspected that Merrick had used company funds to pay for it, so he had asked a representative to monitor Merrick's actions. Sure enough, Merrick's mismanagement and laziness were exposed, angering everyone at the company. As soon as I get back, I'll be returning as president, my father-in-law told me. And as for Merrick, I'm going to fire him. He's not fit for this role. He then revealed another surprise. While Merrick and my mother-in-law were away, we were going to change the locks on the house. They won't be coming back here, he said firmly. I was stunned, but I felt a wave of relief. Things were finally falling into place. A week passed, and then one afternoon, the doorbell rang. The front door rattled as Merrick and my mother-in-law, fresh from Hawaii, tried to get inside. The intercom buzzed incessantly. I picked it up, calmly greeted them, and asked, "How was your trip?" "What?" "Marigold. Open the door," Merrick demanded. "We can't get in." "I can't do that," I replied coolly. "Your father told me not to." Merrick sounded frantic. "What are you talking about? Just open the door already." "Oh, and by the way," I continued, "I heard your trip was paid for with company funds." I cared to explain that. His voice faltered. How did you know about that?" I watched their shocked faces on the monitor, struggling to hold back my laughter. Just then, my father-in-law joined the conversation, his voice firm and full of authority. "So, you really did embezzle money from the company, didn't you?" Merrick was taken aback. "Dad? How are you standing?" "I've been able to stand for days now. Thanks to Marigold helping me with my rehab," he replied. "And I know all about your behavior at work, thanks to the managing director. You've been lazy and irresponsible." "Dad, no. That's not true," Merrick stammered, panicking. "Enough," my father-in-law cut him off. "You're fired. You're no longer welcome at the company. Pack up your things and leave the office immediately." Merrick was now in tears, pleading through the monitor. "Marigold, please, you won't leave me, will you?" I couldn't hold back any longer. I snapped. "What are you talking about? Do you have any idea what you've put me through? You and your mother have taken advantage of me from the start, forcing me to care for your father while treating me like a servant. Do you even realize how much I've suffered?" "Calm down, Marigold. I'm really sorry," he cried. "Your apology means nothing," I replied coldly. "When you left for Hawaii, I realized there was no point in continuing this marriage. I don't want anything more to do with you. I'm done." Merrick stood there, dazed, as my mother-in-law rushed to support him. It was a pitiful scene, mother and son united in defeat. My father-in-law, holding the divorce papers I had picked up earlier, stepped forward and handed them to Merrick. "Sign these now," he ordered. Merrick and my mother-in-law signed the papers without protest, knowing they had no other choice. I kicked them out of the house and locked the door behind them. Even as they pounded on the door and begged to be let back in, my father-in-law and I ignored their pleas. Since that day, I haven't seen either of them. Rumor has it they're both unemployed and living in a comic book cafe, picking up odd jobs just to get by. It's a far cry from the comfortable life they used to lead, but I believe it's the punishment they deserve. After the divorce, my father-in-law graciously told me, "I'll hire a housekeeper from now on. You're free to go live your own life." I took his advice and moved into a place closer to my job. Now, I'm living a peaceful, fulfilling life, and I'll always be grateful to my father-in-law for helping me escape that nightmare. I'm determined to repay his kindness in any way I can.